What's one truth you wish you'd said out loud when you were younger?
You know how there are certain moments that replay in your head long after they're over, like a loop you can't shut off. Except instead of nostalgia, it's pure irritation mixed with a sting that sits in your chest every time you think about it. That's exactly what happened at my dad's retirement dinner, and the funny thing is, I almost didn't go. I knew how these things usually played out in my family. Dad would make a speech, Mark would beam like the golden child he's been since high school, and I would be somewhere in the background, quietly existing, the one who chose a different path, as they liked to call it. I told myself I could handle the usual digs, the subtle reminders that I wasn't the one they bragged about at family gatherings, but deep down, I think I was already bracing for something worse without even realizing it. We were halfway through the evening when Dad stood up, glass in hand, smiling in that way he does when he knows he's about to get a good laugh from the room. He started with all the predictable stuff, how grateful he was for his colleagues, how proud he was of the company's success, how much he valued loyalty and hard work. Then, like it was the most natural transition in the world, he said, and to my son, Mark, who followed in my footsteps, worked hard, and earned his place in this business, thank you for making me proud. He turned slightly, almost like an afterthought, and added, and to my daughter Claire, who took the easy way out, well, I guess there's a place in the world for everyone. And then he laughed, the kind of laugh that isn't cruel enough to be called outright mean, but still carries that edge that tells you it wasn't a joke. And the worst part? The room laughed with him. Not just a polite chuckle, actual laughter, like they were all in on it. In that moment, I didn't feel embarrassment as much as I felt the weight of every single time he'd made me the punchline in my own family. I didn't slam my glass down, I didn't storm out, I didn't even say anything. I just sat there, keeping my face still while my stomach tightened, because showing a reaction in my family was like handing them a loaded weapon. Mark smiled uncomfortably and looked down at his plate, which only confirmed what I already knew: he wouldn't step in. He never did. Dad thrived on this dynamic: Mark the prodigy, Claire the disappointment, and him the clever patriarch who could get away with saying whatever he wanted because it was just teasing. As the night went on, I barely heard anything else. People were talking, clinking glasses, telling stories, but I was stuck replaying that toast over and over, almost like I was watching it from the outside. And with each replay, I started remembering other moments that had felt just like this one. The high school graduation party where he told everyone I'd picked my major because it was the easiest degree they offer. The Thanksgiving where he told my aunt I was still figuring out what I wanted to be when I grew up, even though I'd been working for years. It was all part of the same pattern, and I'd let it slide every time because I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But this time, something shifted. Maybe it was because I'm older now and I don't need his approval. Maybe it was because he did it in front of people who had nothing to do with our family history. Or maybe it was because I've spent years working in an industry where I've seen people like him, men who think their reputation is untouchable, lose everything in the blink of an eye. I knew I wasn't going to yell or make a scene, but I also knew I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. I didn't have a plan when I walked out of that dinner, but the seed was planted. And here's the thing about me: once I decide something's worth my attention, I don't let go of it until I've turned it inside out and figured out exactly how to use it. It wasn't about revenge at that moment. It was about balance. About taking back the power he'd been chipping away at for decades, one smug remark at a time. As I drove home, I thought about how easy it would be to just confront him directly, tell him exactly what I thought of his little toast, but that wouldn't change anything. He'd dismiss it, twist it into me being too sensitive, and then find a way to spin the story so he was the victim of my overreaction. No, I needed something undeniable. Something that couldn't be explained away or brushed off. And if there's one thing I've learned in my line of work, it's that the truth, when it's backed by the right kind of evidence, can do more damage than any insult, any public shaming, any argument ever could. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I didn't know yet what I'd find, but I knew I had the tools and the patience to find it. And as much as I told myself it was just about making a point, a part of me already knew this could go much deeper than just one humiliating moment. I can't tell you the exact second it stopped being about a toast and started being about ending the unspoken hierarchy in my family once and for all, but it happened fast. One minute, I was trying to let it roll off me like always, and the next, I was thinking about old files, about names I'd heard over the years, about things that had been brushed under the rug in Dad's business. I didn't know if any of it would lead anywhere, but I knew I was going to look. And the funny part? If you had told me that night that within a few weeks, I'd be holding something in my hands that could make my father's entire career crumble, I wouldn't have believed you. But that's exactly what happened. And it all started with that laugh. The week after the dinner moved like wet cement, slow and heavy, and even though I tried to focus on work, every time my inbox pinged I half expected it to be a family message pretending nothing happened, which would have been so on brand that it almost made me laugh. Because in our family you could flip a table and someone would still send a funny meme and ask if anyone wanted leftovers. Instead, what I actually got was a routine notification about a quarterly review tied to a vendor that used to be one of my dad's long-standing partners, and I swear I felt a shift in my chest, not because of some dramatic omen, but because the name was familiar in the way a song from childhood is familiar. You can't place it right away, but you know it has been playing in the background for years. I opened the file expecting the usual dull patterns I could audit in my sleep, but there were entries that didn't line up, not by a mile. Timing that looked like someone had pushed money forward to make a quarter look cleaner, and then tried to paper over the gap with vague consulting fees. And before you roll your eyes and say that happens everywhere, let me say this was not a casual rounding error or a lazy plug. This had edges. The signatures were spaced in a way that told me approvals were pushed through at odd hours, and the language in the notes sounded like someone was trying very hard to sound routine, which is exactly how people write when nothing is routine at all. I told myself to slow down, because I know what it looks like when personal baggage drives professional judgment, and I did not want to be the woman who went hunting because her dad made a smug toast. I wanted to be the woman who followed the facts, even if the facts dragged me to a place I didn't want to visit. So I printed the list of approvals, drew a small map of the workflow, and traced every handoff, and the more I traced, the more one thing bothered me, because tucked inside the approval chain were references to a legacy oversight committee my dad had chaired before he stepped back, and I thought, of course it comes back to him, because he built half of these pathways and everyone still treats them like sacred scripture. I called Lisa on my drive home, because she is the one person who will tell me when I am being reckless and when I am being right, and I described the vendor, the timing, the bland language that tries too hard to be invisible. And she listened quietly the way she does, then asked the question I knew was coming, which was whether I was doing this to fix a broken system or to settle a score, and I told her the truth, which was that I wanted both, and if one happened to serve the other, I was not going to apologize for finally standing up for myself after decades of being the punchline. She sighed and said she got it, but to be careful, because once you open the box on family, the lid never fits the same again. That night I pulled old public filings, speeches, donor letters, anything with my dad's name that touched this vendor relationship, not because public statements prove anything on their own, but because people reveal habits in the way they talk about themselves. And sure enough, I found a pattern he loved, a story about mentorship and building the next generation and doing business with a handshake because honor still matters, and I could almost hear his voice selling it, and I realized the story was not just for the crowd, it was for himself, a cheap coat of paint over decisions that had to be smoothed out later by people who did not have the luxury of pretending everything was pure. By the third night of digging, I had a knot that would not relax, and when I flipped one more subfolder, I found a scanned packet with a familiar pen stroke across the bottom of a memo. Not a signature stamp, not a proxy. An actual blue ink signature captured by a lazy office scanner. And the memo was one of those crisp little directives that pretends to be about efficiency and risk management while actually telling people to push something questionable into a quiet corner and mark it as handled. I sat back, stared at it, and fought the stupid urge to cry, not from sadness, but from the relief of knowing I was not crazy, that the unease I had felt for years was not just bitterness or jealousy. It was my gut seeing smoke and finally finding the first proof of fire. I did not march into his house or call him to demand answers, because I have spent my entire adult life watching men like him box their daughters into emotional corners and call it a conversation. So instead I took a breath, wrote myself a list of rules on a sticky note, and stuck it to my monitor. No confrontation without leverage, no public move without backups, no damage to Mark unless he earns it. That last rule mattered more than I wanted to admit, because my brother has always floated near the edge of these things with clean hands, and I was not going to be the one to pull him under just to make a point. The small act of revenge I allowed myself that week was almost boring in its simplicity, which is exactly why it was effective. I filed a quiet preservation request with our internal systems team for any archived correspondence touching the vendor during a certain span of months, framed as a routine compliance check so plain that no one would dare challenge it. And I also set a private alert with a journalist I trust, not a flashy one who chases noise, but the kind who likes paper, dates, and receipts. And I told myself that if the thread kept unspooling and if the pattern turned from sloppy to deliberate, I would hand over what I had without my name anywhere near the byline. When Lisa asked how far I was willing to go, I said I did not know, which was true in that moment. But when the preservation pull came back and I read a short chain where my dad thanked the vendor for discretion during a sensitive transition, I felt the floor tilt. Because the dates matched the window where those approvals had been pushed through at odd hours, and I realized this was not a coincidence or a misunderstanding or a well-meaning shortcut. It was a choice, and it carried his name. I closed my laptop, sat there with my hands flat on the table like I was bracing for an impact that had already happened, and I told Lisa that I had enough to keep going. The next morning, I printed the memo with his signature and slipped it into a plain folder without a label, not because I planned to use it right away, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it in my bag. A reminder that I was not chasing ghosts or settling for a moral victory. I was building something real, and as I left for work I caught myself smiling, which surprised me, because it was not joy or vindication. It was the sharp calm that comes when you know exactly where the weak spot is, and exactly how to press it. I did not know how the end would look, but I knew one thing with total clarity, and saying it out loud felt like locking a door behind me. I was not backing off. Once I let myself admit that this was not a misunderstanding or a clumsy accounting patch, but a choice with a name on it, the way I worked shifted from curious to surgical. And I stopped scrolling like a bored auditor and started building a living map that showed me not just the numbers, but the people who touched them. Because paper trails don't move themselves and approvals don't rubber stamp in the middle of the night without a human who knows which door to knock on, I printed chains, circled dates, drew arrows between departments that should never have been neighbors, and I kept asking the same question any decent auditor learns to ask even when management hates it, which is who benefits and who pays. And the longer I stared at that wall of arrows, the clearer it became that the benefit funneled up into reputation, while the cost leaked out through people who had no microphone to fight back. I called an old contact who used to manage vendor onboarding before she left for a quieter company, a straight shooter named Hannah who never bought into my dad's handshake is everything mythology. And I told her I was reviewing a legacy relationship that looked wrong, not because I wanted gossip, but because I wanted to know how this vendor ever got past the first gate when their paperwork read like a riddle. And she said something I have not forgotten, which was that when a powerful person tells you a vendor is family, the checklist shrinks and the questions soften, and you either push back and get frozen out or you let it slide and tell yourself you'll watch it later. She paused and added that family had been the word of the month the year the vendor slid through, which told me everything about the culture my dad cultivated and nothing about the safeguards he was supposed to champion. From there it was a rhythm I know well. Pull the contracts, match the amendments, chase the change orders, find the control that was bypassed, then find the person who signed off on pretending that bypass was acceptable for timeliness. And do not stop until the exception stops calling itself special and admits it was a pipeline. And just when the work started to feel like one more careful stack of facts, a name popped where it did not belong, a junior staffer who had been talked up in my Dad's speeches as a promising kid he was mentoring, a kid who resigned suddenly with a bland line about pursuing other opportunities, and when I dug into the timing I saw that he resigned the same week one of the odd-hour approvals fired, which no longer looked random when you placed it next to an email from my dad thanking the vendor for discretion. I tracked the kid down through a professional network and asked for 15 minutes over coffee, and he came in looking cautious in the way people do when they think the conversation could cost them another reference. So I kept it simple and said I was reviewing a sequence that had his name in the routing table, and I wanted to understand whether he had seen anything that made him uncomfortable. And he exhaled like he had been holding it for a year and told me that he had raised a red flag about the invoice descriptions, that he had asked for backup, that he had been told at first that he was overthinking it, and then, after a meeting, he was told that leadership had context he did not. And the next week he was pulled from the project and given work no one cared about. He said he left because he decided he did not want to learn the kind of lessons my dad was famous for teaching, and I thanked him and told him I believed him, which I could tell mattered more than I expected. I promised myself from the start that I would not drag Mark unless he stepped into the mud on purpose, so I ran every route that touched his team twice, waiting for a sign that he had known or pushed. And while his initials sat near a few routine budget reconciliations, there was no smoke, only proximity, which irritated me because it would have been easier to be angry at both of them at once. But fairness is only fairness if you practice it when it is inconvenient, so I drew a hard ring around his name and wrote a rule in the margin that I would not cross that ring unless a document forced me. The piece that turned a strong case into a loaded one arrived in a dull export with a file name that looked like it had been chosen by a board intern, a scan of an internal memo drafted by a risk subcommittee that did not exist on any published org chart. It recommended temporary reclassification of advisory services to preserve strategic relationships during leadership transition, which sounds like corporate meditation until you read the distribution list and see my dad's name at the top as the approving executive, followed by 2 external board observers who had insisted on stronger controls the year prior, neither of whom had signed the memo, and below that, a line where my dad had scrawled an approval in his quick, cocky script with the date squeezed into the corner as if the paper itself was trying to resist him. I stood there with the printout in my hand and felt that same sharp calm settle in, the one that shows up when the guesswork ends and the work becomes math. And I knew that as soon as this memo left my bag, the story would stop being mine to steer because the people who care about liability and headline risk would do what they always do, which is protect themselves by letting the truth do the cleanup. Still, I wanted one move that would be mine, one step that made the ground tilt under him before the public part began. So I opened the policy manual he had helped write and used his own thresholds to file a formal risk escalation that forced a third-party review of the very vendor he had blessed. A dry little trigger he could not unwind without admitting he wanted different rules for himself, and I routed it through a chairwoman who owed him nothing and liked receipts. That was my revenge for the day, clean and boring on paper, but devastating in reality, because it started a clock he could not stop, and while that clock ticked I sent an unmarked packet to a journalist who never rushes and never misses, with photocopies of the memo and the routing chains and the dates that lined up a little too neatly with his discretion, thank you, and I did it in a way that made sure my name would never be connected to the drop, because I know how retaliation works and I wanted to be in the room watching when it landed. By the time the sun slid down and the office lights went dull, I had taped a final note to my wall, not a pep talk, just a line to keep my head clear, which said that truth was not the same as revenge, but sometimes it will do the work for you. I shut off my monitor, slid the original memo into the plain folder, and decided that the next step would not be mine to take, because the review request would notify a handful of people by morning, and the journalist would start quietly dialing sources. And my dad would wake up to a normal day that was not normal at all, and the only thing left for me to decide was where to place that folder when I saw him next, because I already knew there would be a table, a toast, and a moment where silence would be mistaken for surrender, and I planned to let that mistake last just long enough to make the fall hurt. Once the third-party review request was locked into the system, I knew there was no reversing the momentum without him drawing suspicion, and that was the first real advantage I'd had over him in years, because for as long as I can remember, my dad has been the one holding the leverage, whether it was over a business negotiation, a family decision, or just the way a conversation ended at the dinner table. Now the roles had shifted, and even though he didn't realize it yet, I could feel the weight of the change in the way I approached each step. I stopped thinking of this as a single confrontation and started treating it like a campaign, where every move needed to make the next one easier, every seed planted needed to sprout at the right time, and every risk had to be calculated so precisely that I wouldn't even have to break stride if something unexpected happened. The key was making sure that by the time I put that folder in front of him, the people in the room would already have their doubts, because a public hit only works when the audience is primed to believe it. And I knew better than to think a sudden accusation would land without context. I began with small nudges, things that wouldn't be traced back to me but would start eroding the shine around him. An offhand remark to an old colleague about how interesting it is that the vendor review is happening now, a casual mention to a retired board member about the reclassification memo, phrased like I was just catching up on work gossip. In my world, information travels fast when it's delivered in a way that feels like it wasn't meant to be shared, and I made sure every piece I dropped was just enough to stick in the mind without being a smoking gun. Meanwhile, I kept in touch with the journalist, who was doing exactly what I hoped, not rushing the story, not chasing a headline, but methodically confirming the details in a way that would make them bulletproof once they were out in the open. He asked for context on the culture my dad built, the mentorship he preached, the way he handled dissent, and I gave him enough to draw the picture without putting myself in the frame. I made sure the evidence was organized in layers, the light surface level anomalies, the mid-tier red flags, and then the hard proof, so that when the story broke, it would feel like the facts were building on themselves rather than dropping all at once. That pacing mattered, because I didn't just want him accused, I wanted him cornered with no room to maneuver. Mark, of course, noticed something was off. He called me one afternoon, his voice careful in that way people use when they're trying not to show their cards, and asked if I was looking into Dad's old projects. I didn't confirm it, but I didn't deny it either. I just told him that in our line of work, things come across our desks and we can't exactly unsee them. There was a pause on the other end, and I could tell he was debating whether to press me, but he didn't. He only said, "Just don't make this about me," which told me that at least some part of him suspected there was more truth to the rumors than he wanted to admit. That worked in my favor, because doubt has a way of keeping people quiet. With the review clock ticking and the journalist's draft nearly ready, I focused on timing. The retirement celebration was already scheduled for the following week, a formal affair with executives, old friends, and enough corporate backpatting to make anyone sick, and I knew that was my stage. If I moved too early, the fallout would lose impact. If I waited too long, someone else might seize control of the narrative. So I decided the night of the dinner would be my moment, but only if I could make sure the story would drop within hours afterward. That way, the confrontation wouldn't feel like an isolated family spat, it would feel like the opening act to something much bigger. To set it up, I created a simple but devastatingly effective trigger. I sent the journalist a copy of the memo with the approval signature, but I didn't give him the full routing chain until the day before the dinner. That way, he could finish his fact-checking in real time, and the publication could go live the morning after the event. I also scheduled a discreet delivery of the same folder to the chairwoman I'd looped into the review process, timed so that she'd open it the morning of the dinner. She was sharp enough to connect the dots immediately, which meant by the time she saw my dad in the banquet hall, she'd already be looking at him differently. The folder I prepared for the dinner itself was deliberate in every way, no dramatic labels, no messy collection of half-baked allegations, just the clean, chronological audit trail with his own handwriting anchoring it. I didn't want a shouting match. I wanted the kind of silence that follows when someone realizes the person they've been mocking has been holding the winning hand the whole time. I even printed the pages on heavy stock so that when I slid them across the table, they would land with a weight you could feel. In the final days before the dinner, I kept my routine as normal as possible, partly to keep suspicion low and partly because I wanted to walk into that room without a single tell in my expression. Lisa kept asking me if I was nervous, and I kept telling her no, not because I'm fearless, but because this wasn't the kind of confrontation that left room for nerves. It was the kind where every move had already been played in my head so many times that the real thing would just feel like pressing execute on a program that had been running in the background for weeks. The night before the dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder in front of me, running through every possible reaction he could have: the dismissive laugh, the angry denial, the attempt to turn it into a private conversation. And I realized that no matter which path he took, the outcome was the same, because by that time tomorrow, the review process would be in full swing, the journalist's story would be queued for publication, and the people who once defended him without hesitation would be rethinking their loyalty. I didn't need to win the room in that moment. I just needed to pull the first block from the tower and watch gravity do the rest. When I finally closed the folder and slipped it into my bag, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. Ready for the look in his eyes when he realized that the daughter he'd written off as someone who took the easy way out had been the one to find the one crack in his perfect armor and pry it open. Ready for the shift in the room when people realized the toast he was about to give would be the last one anyone wanted to hear from him. And ready for the fact that, once it was over, there would be no going back, not for him, and not for me. I knew before I walked into that banquet hall that his script would be the same as always, because men like my father do not improvise when the audience is friendly. They recycle the same lines that have always gotten them applause. And the certainty of that pattern kept me steady while I smiled at people who had known me since I was a teenager and still talked to me like I was a side note to someone else's legacy. I shook hands. I answered the usual questions about work in that polite shorthand that reveals nothing, and I waited, not like a hunter, not like a performer, just like a woman who has finally learned not to explain herself to people who never listened in the first place. When the speeches started, the years of practice showed in every pause and every joke, and the room played its part with warm laughter and earnest nods, and for a moment I caught myself wondering if I was about to blow up something that would echo through more lives than just mine. Which is a fair question to ask even when you are right, because truth has a way of knocking down more than just the target in front of it. Then he pivoted into the family bit, the greatest hits, the myth of hard work and loyalty, the praise for Mark that bordered on a coronation, and finally the line he loves most, about children who follow in their father's footsteps versus the ones who choose the easy way, and I felt the air change in my lungs, not from nerves, but from the final confirmation that he would never stop unless someone built the wall for him. I stood up without rushing, walked over to the head table with the folder tucked under my arm, and placed it in front of him with a quiet that did more than a shout ever could, because the room leaned in rather than recoiled, and I said, calm as if I were asking him to pass the salt, strange, because this audit has your name on it, and the color really did drain from his face, not in that theatrical way people describe after the fact, but in the way a person looks when a private story has just become public without their consent. He tried to laugh it off. He said something about me always being dramatic, but then he saw the first page and the weight of the paper and the blue ink signature that was unmistakably his, and his eyes snapped to mine with a sharp, almost boyish panic I had not seen since I was small enough to think he could never be afraid of anything. There was a beat where he could have tried to pull me close and whisper or wave a hand to dismiss it, but a few people at the table were already reading the headers and recognizing names, and the chairwoman across the room was watching him with the expression of someone who has just connected 3 separate dots and realized they form a straight line. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't deliver a speech, because I did not need to win the room with words. I just needed the room to witness how quietly the pedestal could tilt, so I said that if he wanted to continue his toast he should feel free, and I returned to my table, leaving the folder like a centerpiece he did not want. He tried to keep speaking, and for 1 or 2 sentences, he managed the rhythm, but people were no longer listening to the cadence, they were watching his hands, and the way he kept glancing down like a man trying to memorize a lifeline, and then the questions began. Small at first and easy to deflect, until someone asked whether the risk committee had authorized the reclassification, and his answer landed a hair too slow. And that was it. The shift had happened. The applause track had gone quiet in their heads, and I could feel the room moving to a place he could not follow without tripping over his own words. I did not need to say another thing, because by the time dessert arrived the chairwoman had politely excused herself to make a call that I did not have to hear to understand. And several of the executives who have always treated my father like a mentor were whispering to each other with the stiff posture of people who have just realized they might be in the blast range, and Mark sat very still, not defending, not accusing, just absorbing, which in its own way told me he had known on some level that the stories did not all line up, and he was finally letting the pieces settle into the outline they had always threatened to make. When the dinner finally staggered to its end, he cornered me in the corridor with the folder in his hands, and he started with the move I had predicted, the plea for privacy, the claim that I did not understand the context, the reminder that public scandal would hurt the family, and I let him talk for a minute because I wanted to hear the last version of the story he tells himself. Then I said that the review was already in motion, that people he could not bully were looking at the same pages he was holding, and that the journalist he could not intimidate would publish in the morning, and somewhere around the word morning his shoulders dropped in a way I had never seen. The posture of a man who finally understands that the outcome is not about charm or volume, it is about the arithmetic of choices. The quiet revenge that followed required no drama from me, because the machinery did what it was built to do once it had fuel, and by the time the sun came up his phone was a storm he could not silence. The article was everywhere. The board had scheduled an emergency session, the vendor's name trended for all the wrong reasons, and the risk subcommittee that was never supposed to exist was being discussed in places he did not control. Colleagues who would have bled for him a month ago sent carefully phrased statements to the press. The chairwoman asked him to step back from advisory roles pending the review, and sponsors who built their brand on integrity quietly walked away without looking back. I did not gloat, and I did not send a triumphant message to anyone, not even Lisa, because the win I wanted was not a headline, it was the end of the story where he gets to rewrite me as the weak one. And that win happened in private when he called me that afternoon and, without the armor of an audience, asked what I wanted from him, and I said something simple that he had never given me, which was acknowledgement, not of my pain or my career or my choices, but of what he had done with his and. After a long pause he said he would try to make it right, which is not an apology and not redemption, but it is the first honest sentence I have heard from him in years, and it landed heavier than rage. People will ask if I worry about whether I went too far, and I tell them the same thing I tell myself when the house is quiet and there is nothing left to analyze, which is that I did not invent a story about him, I just refused to carry it for him anymore. And if the weight of it broke the image he loved, then maybe the image was the thing that needed breaking. I will not pretend there is no fallout, because there always is, and some people will never forgive me for choosing the truth over family peace. But the ones whose loyalty depends on silence were never my people to begin with, and the ones who know how this game works have already reached out with a quiet respect I did not expect. As for Mark, he came by the next evening and sat at my table with a stiffness that did not ease for a long while, and we talked about the difference between being close to power and being part of it, and he said he understood why I drew the ring around his name. And I told him I meant it and still mean it, and we agreed on something that feels like a starting line rather than a truce, which is that the next chapter of our family will not be written by speeches, and when he left, I put the folder away in a locked drawer not because I plan to use it again, but because I want the physical reminder of what happens when you stop letting someone else decide who you are, and the last thought I had before I fell asleep was not about victory or vengeance. It was about finally hearing the sound of my own voice without the echo of his, which is, if we are being honest, the only ending I ever wanted.